Okay, let's get started. This is the 65th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And we've been here every Tuesday and Thursday, some other days too, where we've been debating a topic of crucial importance to the security world. And the idea of thought leadership is that we critique today the way that security is being provided in order that we may think about a different type of security and improve security tomorrow. And this week, the topic is something that has been crucial actually in being considered in previous webinars as a challenge. Challenge made all the more important by COVID, but anyway, a challenge. And it is that of achieving consistency and standardization in global security operations. And this is the case with every other week. What we've done is we've invited 3 experts in different parts of the world and with different expertise to discuss and debate these issues. And is the case as normal, I will invite first of all 3 of them to introduce themselves. And once they've done that, I will invite them each to make their opening statement. And just to remind you that a copy of this recording will be available on the website, so will a blog. So, and if you've got any questions, can I ask you please to use your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Get your questions in early, because those who've done these webinars before will know we move fast. So question and answer button if you wouldn't mind, and we'll get to your question best we can. So without further ado, let's go to our panelists then and get them to introduce themselves. And we're going to go to the United States first, and Melissa. Melissa, introduce yourself first, please.
Hi there, my name is Melissa Mack. I am a director at Witt O'Brien's and I am a crisis management and business continuity consultant.
Thank you very much indeed. And from there to Delhi in India, and Pallavi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pallavi Ajay and I'm based in Delhi, India. I'm a geopolitical and international security consultant, and I'm also co-founder of a forum called Asian Pathfinders.
Thank you very much indeed. And back to a barge on the Thames in London, of course. Mike, please introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you, Martin. I'm Mike Kroll. I'm a global security advisor and I'm based just outside London.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Well, another expert panel, and people write to me and tell me how good we are at getting panelists from around the world to discuss these topics. Let's go to our opening statements. This is where we ask each of the panelists in just 3 minutes to give us their view on this topic. Melissa, your opening statement, please.
Right. So I am going to start out with a little bit of a controversial statement, so apologies in advance, but I have seen in global companies that have regional or local operations around the world, a lot of times companies that are headquartered in the US or the UK tend to take an approach of we at headquarters know exactly how everything should be done and sometimes do not take into consideration the need for local context or local nuance. So I think, in my opinion, the best way to work with that is to identify the pillars that you want in your security program. Make sure that they tie specifically to the mission of the organization as much as possible. Make sure you've got your elevator speech for key stakeholders to make sure to get them on board with you. And then I recommend engaging in a listening tour. And I use that as a listening tour specifically. So sit down with key stakeholders, if that's region leaders, if that's business unit leaders, et cetera, throughout your organization, and open up with questions and let them talk to you first for a couple of reasons. It lets them know that you care about their opinion. It also helps get them on your team. And then you might find that you have a local or regional leadership that's advocating for you. And it also helps add to the idea that security is everybody's job. So I recommend a listening tour, and then with the results of what you hear and what you learn in that listening tour, bring that back to your overall strategy, to your pillars. Make sure that you're understanding what the local leadership and the regional leadership are concerned with, and then make sure that their concerns can work within the pillars of your program.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. Well, I tell you what, that makes sense. My first question might be, why is it not obvious and why can't we do it? Okay, let's go to Pallavi, and we're in Delhi. Pallavi, your opening statement, please.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I think, Melissa, that was one of the things that I was going to put across. So thank you for saying that. So I'm going to look at just the main challenges that come across when you're looking at doing the standardization aspect of it. One, I've divided into a few aspects. One is like the physical aspect, right? Your time zones are different, your geographies are different, your terrains that you're operating in, those are different. So the challenges that come across when you're operating in the different physical environments can be very unique. So that's one. One is the cultural, the societal aspect, the government regulatory aspect. So the cultural aspect also gives rise to what is your risk appetite, right? as an organization that's operating in, say, India, you might be open to more risks, say, a crime like a pickpocketing might be a regular thing here. But if you're in a Scandinavian country and that's a big crime, because the rate of crime there is much lower. So the cultural context is very important to understand when you're doing these kind of global security operations. The other one is the government and the regulatory aspect, right? Because security is also governed by the local governments and the local governments in those countries. So that's very important. Those can be a challenge when you're doing the standardization across the globe. The third one would be the organizational aspect for me, would just be as an organization, do you understand what is a risk? Have you defined it locally, globally on those levels? What are you protecting, right, as an organization? That's also very important to know. Are you protecting your assets? Are you protecting the people, the brand image? That's very important. And is it consistent across the board, right? Be it in India, US, UK, everything. And then again, the internal cultural barriers. I think every society has its barriers, and then those crop in when you're operating in that geography. So what would be the employer-employee relationship in India would be very different than, say, possibly in US and other places. And again, the role of security team, what is the role of the security team in these organizations? Uh, One of the things that I always keep seeing nowadays is the blurring of the line between the physical and the cyberspace and the risks that come across when you're operating in these different geographies. So that, and I think, as Melissa said, a lot of times the global security operations is seen from a very Western perspective or the lens, especially when you're MNC. So that's very important to understand.
Thank you very much indeed. So just a reminder to the audience, if you get your questions on the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and as soon as we've heard from Mike, we'll start to get involved in discussion and questions. Mike, your opening statement, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Martin. And thanks to Pallavi and Melissa. I think you both eaten most of the sandwiches already. But I'd just like to open by talking a little bit about, why is this subject important? And I think a lot of this is about consistency, and consistency builds trust. And increasingly, organizations, have a global presence, but their products at the far end, they expect them to be exactly the same. It's a little bit like, if you buy a Big Mac in Beijing, you expect it to taste the same as it does in Boston. And I think increasingly, if you're consuming security in Sydney, you want it to taste the same as it does in Santiago. This makes your staff much more comfortable, much more trusting, much more instinctive when they're using your security services, be it access control or whether it's responding to alarms. If, say, in London, the fire alarm is a bell, and in New Delhi, it's a buzzer, that immediately creates confusion. So, at a basic level, a very fundamental level, getting people responding instinctively to the various aspects of security are really important. For your traveling staff, this is absolutely critical as well. If you've got people who are going around multiple sites, you want to make sure that the badging processes are the same, that the visitor protocols are the same. And also, this is about efficiency. So you can scale, you can train, you can design career paths for people, you can equip your security teams, you can have an alignment of effort if you achieve that consistency. And it's about your staff and your customers having confidence in what you're doing. And I think there's a legal aspect to this as well, and it's about duty of care. And increasingly with global organizations, the standard of duty of care will be pitched essentially at the standard of your headquarters. So if you're deploying people from, say, New York to Chile, then if your standards in Chile aren't comparable with those in New York, you leave yourself open to litigation and mistrust. So let me leave it there and look forward to some more questions soon.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Mike. Well, let me just come first of all to Melissa. Melissa, you outlined an ideal. I just wonder why, in a way, that's obvious. I mean, why is it not be done everywhere like that? That makes sense.
That's a great question. I have seen a lot of security professionals, and because so many security professionals come from either a military or a law enforcement background, that environment is a very structured, very hierarchical, very chain of command background. And I've seen a lot of folks that make that transition from military or law enforcement into the private sector, especially, that really struggle with the culture shift. That they struggle for the first year and sometimes multiple years thereafter to adjust to the idea that there's not necessarily a strict chain of command that is never questioned. So I think that a lot of security people present themselves initially as that I'm the expert, I know everything, you will do what I say, I am right. And they don't do that key listening aspect that I was speaking of. So I think engaging on that listening tour can help bridge that gap, especially for those that are first making that transition from military and law enforcement into the private sector, to really help understand the cultural context that they're jumping into.
Yeah, it makes sense. You know, last Thursday's webinar, Melissa, was actually on retirees from the public sector. And we tackled some of those issues there. Pallavi, let me come to you. Now you've outlined reasons why things are different, language, culture, and all the things you're talking about. Mark Rowe has got a question. And the point is, can security tap in to this movement for consistent services? Now, you've just given the reasons, haven't you, why you can't, because it's different everywhere. It's illusory. Don't try. It's different.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm not saying don't try to make it consistent.
No, I am. I am. I'm saying, why would we? Carry on. Sorry.
No, but I think one of the things is there are some things that are business critical, right? Your organizational conduct, your IT policies, or your travel security management. There are certain things that are business. So you have to identify what is business critical for you and then standardize those across, say, the board. But obviously taking into account the local regulations, the cultures. But I think there are certain things you can definitely standardize. And those are the ones that you should work at. And I think if I would have to say, I would say identify the ones which are very, very business critical across the globe, and then end up standardizing and putting the consistency in them. Don't look at standardizing everything, because when you look at standardizing everything, it puts in a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape kind of a thing. And then you just, then people just get tired of following so many procedures and policies. So that's.
Yeah, I mean, this makes sense to me. I mean, Mike, on that topic, would you agree, Mike, with Pallavi on this?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think Pallavi spoke a lot about, you know, the different culture, different language, different legal context. The other aspect is every organization has a different presence in each country. So, for example, I used to run the Foreign Office Overseas Security Network. And in countries like, you know, Iraq and Afghanistan, you'd have a very substantial security structure, complete with professionals, lots of equipment, lots of attention. And then you'd have smaller embassies in places like, Maputo or Cambodia, and they would have no security professionals at all. So you're relying on your diplomatic staff to provide all of the security effort as well. And on top of that, Melissa made a really good point, you know, about the listening tour, and I really like that expression, Melissa. I'm going to use it. But often there is a tension between headquarters and the field, and a friend of mine who used to work for a British stationery company called W.H. Smith & Sons gave me a good example of this. His name was Kevin Adams, and he was a regional manager in the southeast of England. And he used to think he was pretty good at his job. He got all the results, all the metrics were looking great, but there were some things from headquarters that he didn't like doing. So he just wouldn't, he would just let them be. And then one day, some chap from headquarters said, Kevin, you know, let's have a meeting, 9 o'clock Monday morning down at your place. And he said, where should we meet? My office? He said, no, let's meet outside the store. So Kevin and the bloke from headquarters were standing outside the store. And the bloke from headquarters pointed at the sign. He said, what does that say? And Kevin said, well, it says W.H. Smith & Sons. And the bloke from headquarters said, when it says Kevin Adams & Son, we'll do it your way. Until then, it's my way. So.
Yeah, well, I get that. And of course, Mike, you did outline the points in your opening statement about why this issue is important. I mean, I guess a question is, though, I mean, what's coming through here is that we hold up consistency and standardization as an unqualified good. And already I'm beginning to think, well, it's not an unqualified good. I mean, perhaps what we mean, Melissa, is be consistent and standard across what Pallavi calls business critical, or what others might be core issues, but don't do it across the board, because that's going to get in the way of local context and local application. Right, Melissa, or not?
I think so. And I really like what Pallavi said about looking at what's business critical. I think that you've got to make sure that whatever you're standardizing, whatever you're making consistent throughout the organization globally, everybody needs to understand why it's important. You've got to do the work, the awareness, the education, the relationship building to make sure that people understand why this aspect, particularly of security, is important, why security in general is important, what their role is in the overall picture. And a great way to do that is focusing on what's business critical, what's the mission of the organization, how does this help us meet business critical needs, and how does this help us carry out our mission?
But the thing is, Melissa, how do you in the same breath, it's easy in a way, right? The WH Smith and Son example Mike's just got, I get this, it's easy. We do it this way and we do it all the way around the world. If you're not doing it this way, you're not being consistent, you're not being standard. I get that. But that is a theoretical ideal, which in practice is impossible. And that's part of the problem here. It's a miscommunication of the message. You see where I'm going, Melissa? That there's a theoretical textbook ideal, and that's easy. That's the sign should be this color, wording should be that sign, and so on. But it's not like that, and security is not like that. People have said the threats are differently. I'm just wondering, Melissa, when we talk about this standardization consistency, it's held up to be something that we've got to be very cautious about the way we hold it up. Melissa, would you agree?
I do. And I think, again, it comes back to why are we holding this up? Why is it important to be consistent? And what is it that we need to be consistent? And again, keep it tied to the mission, keep it tied to what's business critical.
Yeah, okay. Pallavi, you agree?
Yeah, I think I agree totally, because the whole thing is it has to be business critical, mission critical. But I think one of the things is the standardization and the policies that we put in place, they have to be adaptable to the situation that we are putting it in, right? It has to be, adaptability is key, because if you become rigid about the policies, very, very rigid, then people just don't follow it. Like if you say, oh, this is exactly how, and this is how it's to be done and nothing else, sometimes rigidity just ends up being a doom. So I think, and what COVID-19 has taught us is these things are very, very dynamic. Security is very dynamic. The world that we live in, very dynamic. So we have to be adaptable. We have to be agile to be able to change with the situation. I think that's very critical.
Okay, I understand that. Mike, Dr. Glenn Kitteringham, who's a former panelist, actually he's a former chair as well, but a former panelist, and he says, what happens when the head office is wrong? Now, this was actually one of the thoughts that came to my mind when we started off about setting the example at head office. Well, who says that? Who says that's the good place to do it? Mike? Melissa, I'll come to you afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to start, because one thing I always believe is that headquarters never has a monopoly on wisdom, and local circumstances are really important. When I worked in the field, I've been desperately frustrated by people in headquarters using the 5,000-mile screwdriver to try and fix local problems. And I think this is where it sometimes helps, instead of having rules, having guidance. This is essentially the difference between Napoleon and Wellington. The Napoleonic Code, they write down everything, whereas the Wellingtonian approach is English common law, which gives you some flexibility. Guidance just provides the sort of buffers, the parameters within which you work, whereas if you have security rules, it's something you have to follow slavishly and doesn't allow the same level of flexibility. So in terms of headquarters being wrong, yes, they're definitely not fallible, but I think that the headquarters has a key role in setting the overall framework and tone, and providing leadership and the listening skills that Melissa referred to early on.
Yeah, I guess part of the problem, Mike, isn't it, is that we tend to see the authority in head office just by the word head office the words have got authority about it. It tends to be where power sits. And in this thing called security, and maybe Melissa touched on this just a minute ago when she pointed to the fact that some people who are in charge of security departments aren't always best suited to understand international operations. It's just, there's a skill set there, there's experience there, there's understanding of business there, understanding operations there. Do you think that your peer group involved in that leadership role, Mike, would you say that they are geared up to do a good job on understanding operations? Do you think the qualifications and the experience of people in those positions is good?
I think it varies across the board. If you're running an international operation, I think it's really important that you have international exposure, and not just from sitting in a headquarters, but from working in the field, from working in different cultures, perhaps across different organizations and sectors as well. I think you really need to be able to stretch. Yeah, it's variable across the patch. I think one of the interesting dynamics in recent years, and I've been in this for a while, but modern communications mean that you can reach out and communicate with all of your subunits much more effectively. I think in the old days, you might send them a letter, then you sent them an email. Now, being able to have this level of interaction with all of your folks in the field really helps get alignment of purpose and understand the challenge that they're facing as well.
Yeah, and of course, this experience of COVID has taught us how it's all doable in a way. Let's just really let me just come back to you on this, because I'd like to give you a point. Actually, about Glenn's point specifically about head office. It's an interesting point, isn't it? Really, I mean, there is this sort of slave to say it's got to come from there, but it's not uncontroversial. It's not always right.
I think it opens up an opportunity to ask a different question. That question being, what do my local experts say? Where can I draw upon expertise about local context, local nuance, local requirements, local government regulations to really inform the program there specifically, but the program globally as well? And drawing on specialists within your team who have that knowledge that you don't necessarily have. Many heads are better than one. So how can you gather the data from your team and from local leadership and regional leadership to gain a better overall comprehensive picture that then informs your entire program?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's move on. We've got lots of questions coming in. Pallavi, let me come to you about Michael Cummings' question. Also an interesting one, in that we're talking about standardization here on a global scale. And of course, there are plenty of standards out there. And Mike, I'll come to you after this. There are plenty of standards out there. And it was raised on a previous webinar, right? That one of the problems with standards is that the world becomes a slave then to following a standard rather than following good practice. And there's a difference. There's potentially a difference. How do you, Pallavi, view standards generally? And do you think they have a place here? Pallavi first, then Mike.
All right. I think standards do draw upon a lot of best practices. So there are industry experiences. So you do require standards for the standardization of operations globally. It's that you cannot just throw away the standards and say, we're just going to stick to best practices, because then it becomes that the best practice what is in India might be very different from UK. So I think you do need these standards to follow. But like I said earlier also, and the whole idea of listening to everyone, the rigidity shouldn't be set in with just the standards. You should be able to adapt to the change. And I think that comes from that balance between standards and the operations of your organization's needs, basically. If your organization's need is not to have such strong standards in every aspect, then you pick, like I said earlier, the business critical ones, and you apply standards to that, and then you stick to it. But it's very important that what is important to your business and how your business functions, that is there. And I think that comes from having a very open line of communication across your divisions, right? Across your headquarters, what Mike said, you do need the headquarters to set the agenda and the policies and procedures. And you do need the senior management buy-in, but you need, similarly, you need these standards also to give you a direction, just the way you need a senior management to give you a direction. But I think that open line of communication, transparency, trust is very important too.
Okay, so Mike, so Pallavi's point is standards are there, they give you direction, but they also can get in the way of practice. Just on a point here, Mike, Simon Chance chipped in with this very point, this very observation. He's slightly ahead of me because I was going down the same route. Standards can take you so far, but they need some application to context. Where do you stand on this, Mike? And are they good ones?
Well, I think standards have to be context specific, and obviously there are quite a few out there from from the very ISOS, from ACES, from GISF, and I think they have to be adapted to whatever sector you're in. But alongside that, I think it always helps to have a performance management framework. And what I generally do is have an access with all the subunits along the top, so they can be sort of by country. And then I have things like number of incidents, false alarms, the updating of security plans, number of visitors, cost of security per square foot of the building or number of staff. And if you rag everything, red, amber, green, fully compliant, partially compliant, not compliant, then something really interesting starts to emerge. If you have a common theme, for example, no one's updating their crisis management plans, that's a systemic issue. If you have a country that is falling behind on everything, then that is a local issue. So I think if you use a form of matrix management, applied to your policies, procedures, plans, and standards, then it helps highlight where you might need a management intervention. And it could be that people haven't updated their plans because they don't understand them, because the headquarters was late in issuing them. And it could be that, say, your local security manager has been sick and he hasn't been able to make the various targets. So they need support. But I think that kind of red, amber, green matrix standards against your various subunits is a really powerful tool when it comes to international management.
Well, you see, I like that. I mean, but in some ways, what do you call it? A performance management framework strikes me as a lot more useful than a standard.
Yes, but you need the standards to underpin that. So, you can't just say, do your crisis management plans, because you'll end up of having a different plan for every subunit. If you provide the framework for it with the subheadings that people can fill in that can then be verified by headquarters, then you have standardization and a level of local flexibility as well.
Well, Melissa, you're nodding, so just let's bring you in here, because you agree?
I do, wholeheartedly. I think one of the greatest benefits of having standards is it provides you a source of excellence to cite in how you're developing and building your program, and also enforcing your program. When somebody says, well, why do we need to update our plans on an annual basis? You can say, well, this standard says so. And that's all fine and good, but you really need to be able to tie why that standard is appropriate to your overall program. I also like what Pallavi said about making sure that standards apply in context. So the standards exist, obviously, but when standards are written and developed, they don't take the context of your specific organization into account. So you've got to find those ways to pull the main concepts from the standards, the key components in there, make sure that you've got all of the components as a part of your program addressed in a way that's appropriate for your organization.
I mean, Melissa, do you recommend standards? I mean, are they good ones?
There are good ones. In my area, I like business continuity, the ISO 22301. That's my standard of choice for business continuity. But again, it's a good basis for developing a business continuity management system, but it's not the end all be all for a specific organization. It does require that the data gathering, the cultural, the context, the local context, the organizational context, to make sure that you map it to the organization in a way that works for the organization.
Yeah, okay. I mean, Pallavi, let's just one more on this issue, because it is a big one, actually. I'm forever hearing about standards. A little story here. When I was doing the research for the Outstanding Security Performance Awards, I was trying to find how you measure excellence. And when I did research around the world on this, at one point I thought standards would be my reference point. But there was a lot of feeling that wasn't a good way to go, principally because if you didn't have a standard, it didn't mean you weren't excellent. And partly because having a standard doesn't mean you're excellent. And I suppose what Melissa and Mike are saying, it's a reference point that needs to be adapted. And I guess that's where you're coming from on this.
Yes, I think what Melissa just said, right? The organizational context is very, very important. If the 23301, also the 31000, the 31000, ISO 31000, it gives you a risk management framework, which is what I work with. But if I don't understand the organizational context in which I'm applying that kind of a thing, the reference point, and I keep applying to every business unit, every organizational department of mine, then it's not good. It's just going to what Mike said, if the local manager is not updating it on a timely basis, then it just bogs everything down for the rest of the team also.
Sorry. That's believe it or not, everyone, that's the panelist on Thursday calling me.
Really?
No, no. So I think one last point I'll just say is, when you're looking at a standard, a security standard, ensure that it's tied into the organizational strategy and you're engaging the asset owners who are important in this kind of standard implementation process. I think that's very important.
Okay, so I get this. I get this. I mean, Mike, I'm going to come to you with a question from Alietin Kangos. Right now, you in your opening statement justified why it was important to have the same access control in one part and another, and you gave the example, I think, of an alarm and a bell in different countries.
Yeah.
And Alietin's point is, since it's different everywhere, why do I need to have the same access control in Kabul and London? Interesting point, Mike.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is difficult to understand if you're in either of those subunits and you stay there exclusively. However, a lot of people travel within international organizations, and I think that's what makes it really important. There are some exceptions, though. I mean, the classic is probably run, hide, tell. You know, that's what we do here in England, you know, but in America, you're made of sterner stuff. You run, hide, you fight them off, you know, but it would be inappropriate for us to, if you're working for an American company, for example, in the UK, it would be inappropriate to tell your staff to fight. You're undermining what Pallavi mentioned earlier on, you know, local laws, local regulations, you know, the security culture that your government puts out. I think there are, you know, that's a good question. And if you stay exclusively in a subunit in a particular country, it doesn't really matter what color your passes are or what sound your bells and whistles make. But if you're running internationally with people who are transferring between different subunits, then it's important.
Melissa, you agree?
I do. I also think there's something to be said for making sure that your access control systems communicate globally so that you don't have individual locations where people at headquarters have no idea if the access control systems are online, if there's been a fire that's destroyed them, anything like that. So you do certainly want to have visibility to your local locations from your headquarters.
Yeah, okay. I mean, here's a question I've got for all of you. Let me just read you a question actually from Timothy Ninzomo from Kenya, who's written to me to say about this panel. And the point he's really making is that there are so much that gets in the way of being consistent international. He talks about the labour supply, resources, the amount of technology you've got, the quality of it, political instability, the local environment, poverty, complacency, lack of capacity buildings, the lack of motivation and commitment of people. Some of these you've mentioned. But I mean, I guess this is the point I'd like to ask each of you. How good are companies in standardizing their performance across the globe? I mean, generally speaking for a minute, Melissa, generally speaking for a minute, and I'll come to each of you with this. It seems to be such a challenge. How effective is the security world at doing this? Melissa first.
Well, I think there's a huge range. And I think it varies by company. I think it varies by region. I think it varies also by industry. Industries that are more heavily regulated are going to enforce global standards in their security department as well. Industries that are less heavily regulated are going to be less concerned about that. That also ties into resource and budget for the security department. What do we need to have from a legal requirement perspective, from a regulation perspective? So there's a mix. I do think in general it's trending positively, as are many things in the security industry. I think that we're seeing more and more companies that are taking better account of what the headquarter requirements are and what the local requirements are, and finding ways to marry those two. But that's not universal just yet.
Yeah, okay, that's slightly positive. Could you be as positive, Pallavi? And what's the main barrier to being good internationally, Pallavi?
Okay, I think I agree with whatever Melissa said. It very she's covered it well. I think one of the barriers I would just say is lack of transparency between different and lack of communication at times between the different levels of operations, right? Your local, your regional, your global. I think that line of communication always has to be open. And I think one more point I'll add to what Melissa said is just like we have the core values, missions, and vision of an organization. You need to have an organization-wide security culture, and you have to make people understand, because the whole idea of budget, what Melissa just said, is very important. And if people don't understand that having good security and good security practices is an asset to the organization and not a cost. And that's where you would get much more involvement from different departments who are the stakeholders here.
Yeah, I mean, here's a point, Pallavi, on this very point. This is slightly cropped up in previous webinars. Can you, in a security function, in an international organization, be effective in this way without the support of the senior management of the organization?
I don't think so. I think what I did touch on this earlier also, that it's very important to have that security, the top management buy-in, because who is going to sign off the check, right? Who does the CSO report to? Your chief security officer, the regional, the local, the global security office chief. Who does he report to is very important. If he reports directly to the CSOs, who does he report to? And that's very important. That's how you can get the top management buy-in. If you're not at the decision-making table, or if you don't have the ears of the people who are at the decision-making table, you're always going to be considered as a cost overhead and not as an asset to the organization.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that I get that. Mike, let me just bring you on this issue. I'm interested in know what, first and foremost, how effective you think organizations are at it. And follow up, what's the main barrier in your opinion to achieving ultimate performance here?
I mean, good questions. Let me just pick up on some of the other issues that one of your interlocutors was bringing in there. And it was about explaining the difficulties and, you know, why was it important? You know, it's important. It's about efficiency. It's about effectiveness. It's about duty of care, but also in terms of, you know, keying in with the business processes. You know, I think, you know, HR, marketing, finance, you know, administration, they will all have consistent processes and standards throughout the organization. And I think, you know, it's really important that headquarters security takes an enterprise approach to everything as well, with that same level of standardization, and recognizing that, you know, there are a lot of things locally. I mean, I think you had a colleague out there in Nairobi, which is obviously going to be, you know, quite different to New Delhi. But, you know, the more you can sort of standardize and streamline and simplify, you know, security processes, I think the more buy-in that you get at top level and, you know, with all of your staff.
Yeah, okay. So what's the main barrier, Mike? What's the barrier to achieving this consistently?
I think unequal application of security resources. I mentioned earlier that at an embassy in Afghanistan and Kabul, you know, you have an awful lot of resources. At an embassy in Phnom Penh or Maputo, you have very few resources. So I think that is probably, from what I've seen, that is one of the key barriers. And I think one of the ways of overcoming it is having, you know, the standardization, the policy, the procedures that are universally applied.
Yeah, I mean, Melissa, you know, when these webinars, you know, when we've been doing these, the first 64, and it's sort of coming up again today, you go away thinking, or I've gone away thinking, you know, the problem here is that if you've got a very effective security leadership, you're going to be fine. But the problem is, and this is, we had a webinar on security leaders, okay? And of course, we've got good people on because you can't really have bad people on and criticize them. And one of the points that came out of this, and you mentioned it yourself actually, when you talked about people coming out of, you know, certain backgrounds into senior roles, doesn't give you a good grasp of international operations. And just as a very quick one, I remember one conversation I had one day. I was doing an interview with security leaders as part of a research project. And and these were both very good people, I might add. But one of the guy was from the military. And he said to me, do you know, I was very senior in the military and I came into this organization and I've no idea why they put me in charge of security, because the truth of the matter is I've never once in my whole career dealt with crime. And here I am protecting them against crime. I mean, it was very good, don't get me wrong, it happens. But this security leadership bit, isn't it? It is fundamental we get the right people. And there's been this shift now, because of what you're talking about today, all three of you, understand business operations. That, you know, the message I get from you is understand business operations. That's the big deal. Forget how much you know about crime. Forget how much you know about how policing works. Would you say that was right, Melissa? And do you think there's a gap there at the top?
I think you can have the best security leaders in the world, and if they don't understand the context in which they're operating, they're going to struggle.
But they're not a security leader then.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. So they do need to understand business operations, and yes, they do need to have the expertise for which they were hired for, but they also need to understand that there's expertise that they still need to glean from other locations, from other people, from leaders in the business, from leaders in the region, from leaders locally. You wouldn't walk into a position and assume that you know everything in the world. You have to use the resources that you can work with, that are available to you. In order to get those resources on board with you, you've got to make sure that you're developing those relationships. And that includes taking the time to understand the business operations, understand what's critical to the business, making sure that you are understanding that so you can then apply those to the standards in a way that work for the organizational context.
Okay, yeah. I mean, let me just tell you what, Pallavi, what's coming to my mind is this point is head of security needs to be good at business, doesn't matter how good they are at security. Right or wrong?
I would say not totally right, not totally wrong in those senses, because I think if they don't understand security and they just understand business, then that just defeats the purpose of having a security or head. I think it has to be a good balance between both, because if they don't understand what the security issues are, but as Melissa said, and we've been saying it over the entire session, is if you don't understand the organizational context, it is not possible for you to give the security that's required across whichever region you're working in, be it a local security manager to be a global security manager. If you don't understand the ground realities that you're facing, you will not do. But the ground realities also come from understanding what your business is. So that's it's a combination of both, I would say.
All right, okay. And I was just being provocative because I can be provocative. Mike, just a quick question here from Sean Wilson. He's asked the question. In this time at the moment where business need to be agile and respond to market conditions, standardization doesn't seem to be the best approach. Do you think that's right? And I think he's talking about obviously the way in which COVID has grown and presented threats around the world.
I'm not sure that he is. I'm not sure exactly whether this is a question of being right or wrong, but I would imagine if you do have any staff who are traveling, then consistency and standards in the way that an organization manages COVID-19 is really important. So Sean, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that you are right. I still believe that consistency within an international organization is really important.
Good. Well, I like you disagreeing. It's good. Punch up on thought leadership is never bad. Melissa, just final comment from you on one question. Gabriel Badia, a former panelist actually, is just wondering whether the compliance to business continuity standards is playing a role in how successfully a company copes with this current crisis. I'm just going to give you 20 seconds on this.
Yes and no. I think the trend in business continuity prior to COVID-19 was to focus a lot on technical processes. We're really trending towards operational resilience. COVID-19 helped really put into play that people are a critical part of business continuity, not just technical processes, making sure that all of your people are actually able to carry out critical processes, that they're available to work, and that they're not sick or taking care of children or family members. So I think COVID-19 has really applied the lens of people focus to business continuity.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Simon Chan, who put several points on them, which I drew off in the questions. Okay, I'll see what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you each 10 seconds, just 10 seconds to make a final comment. 10 seconds, panel. Pallavi, just 10 seconds, your summary of the key points you want people to take away from this webinar.
I think just 10 seconds. So that's, I'm going to say first and foremost, identify what are your business critical functions and work on those for standardization. Also understand the local context. And thirdly, what Melissa just said, people are important. You can invest in technology, but understand that people are at the core of your security.
Okay, Melissa, 10 seconds.
I would encourage people to use local and regional resources as an opportunity rather than as a barrier. Make sure that you are taking that opportunity and see it as a blessing, really, to learn more, to make sure that the standards that you're implementing and applying from the corporate headquarters really work in all areas.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Mike, finally, 10 seconds, just final comment.
Well, if I could take the words of Stanley McChrystal, I think if you're running a global organization from headquarters, I think the three key things are listen, learn, and lead.
That sounds great. Panel, thank you so much for your time. And like all good discussions, and as is often the case on this, we could have gone on. And that's the point about thought leadership, is to raise ideas, stimulate debate, and continue the conversation. Thank you so much indeed for that. A few final brief comments, if you wouldn't mind, please. I've got just a quick reminder to you that when we're thinking about doing things well, the Outstanding Security Performance Awards, the entries are still open in Germany, but only 2 days. In Romania, only 3 days. Gabriel Badir is was one of the question masters from Romania today. And South Africa, you've got a bit of time, 15th of February, but get your entries in early. And just to say, get the 24th of November in your diary. That's a Thought Leadership Summit being held in the Benelux. And at that, we're going to present the Benelux Auspers as well. Kenya's coming around soon, so look out for that. And the Tackling Economic Crime Awards are on the 9th of December. They're at 3:30 in the afternoon. They're a virtual, so you can attend free of charge. Get that date in your diary, 9th of December. Finally, to say that, as always, we're going through it all over again on Thursday, when we're going to be looking at the relationship between crisis management and security. How closely are they aligned now? It came up today, and one of the questions we're going to be addressing is, and this, some people are saying, with the development of crisis management in this crisis, does it show security is less needed because they're doing the work, or more needed because it's a different type of skill set? We'll be covering that on Thursday. Once again, thank you very much indeed to panel. Thank you very much indeed to the audience for the questions. And thank you in the background to Hannah Miller and to Christine Brooks. And just to say to you that the idea of these thought leadership is to engage in debate and generate ideas. My panel did an excellent job of that today, helped by very good audience questions. See you on Thursday, I hope. And wherever you are in the world, until we meet again, stay safe.